Okay, good evening, and welcome to the first video on the second channel. Thank you to everyone who's subscribed so far. This is basically just a way for me to post less algorithm-friendly content, I suppose, because YouTube generally gets quite irritated with me whenever I post this sort of thing on the main channel. So it's nice to just have a place where I can post more free-form, creative stuff without YouTube just breathing down my neck the whole time. And before I forget, I'll start things off by saying that despite the fact that I'm recording this in November, I'm probably not going to be able to get this edited and posted until December, in which case, happy holidays to you all. Hope you're all having a nice festive period. And that's actually quite relevant to what we're going to be doing today, which I will happily tell you all about once I give another big thank you once again to the patrons. Thank you all for your continued support, and I hope you enjoy some of the things I've got lined up for the new year. Now, first of all, a couple of points of follow-up. Number one, I changed the indefinites around slightly. At this point, I can't even really remember what it was before, but the main thing I remember changing is this form here, the yaku. It used to be waku, and I changed the W to a Y, just because I prefer the sound of it. So that gives us our finalized forms for all of these indefinites. I also finalized our third-person pronouns, and I did end up reducing quite a few of the forms to make them a bit simpler. And also, last time I was struggling with this distal demonstrative, but I ultimately settled on the protoform ku, because that means that the human singular and the animate singular are identical in all cases, which I like, because I just like the idea that those two classes are kind of in the process of merging. But now, onto the main order of business. The last time I posed the question of whether or not we felt like we were ready to move on to the writing system. And somewhat to my surprise, the unanimous consensus was that we should do at least a few more videos finishing up the grammar before moving on to the script. So that being the case, I have taken the liberty of compiling a to-do list of things to nail down before we're ready to move on to the orthography. And some of these are more long-term than others, and some of them will probably require me to do some work off-air, just for the sake of time and not boring you all to tears. Like these first two, finalize the declensions and finalize the verb conjugations. So instead of having to go through every single individual form for every noun that we create, we can just immediately sort the noun by its protoform into one of a set number of declensions. And I think, I haven't confirmed this yet, but I think between nouns and adjectives, we have a large enough sample size at this point to be able to do that. And possibly the same with verbs as well, although they're a bit trickier, just because they are considerably more irregular, because they involve lots of stem changes and infixes and things like that. I'm going to have to try and go through them and see what the major patterns are and try and sort them as best we can. I also want to make some more possessive classifiers, because so far we've only got, I think, 4 of them. And I don't want to go too crazy. I don't want to have, 30 of them like some of the oceanic languages have. But I'm thinking a set of, 7 to 12 would be along the lines of what I'm feeling. And I've been doing some more research into that, which I will share once it becomes relevant. Also need to figure out exactly how the reflexive works, because we still don't have a specific form for the reflexive. Because we've got the detransitive, which is basically like a middle voice that can be interpreted as reflexive, reciprocal, anti-passive, or passive, depending on the context. And I want some word that signifies and clarifies that this is in fact a reflexive, which should be relatively straightforward, just haven't got around to it yet. Then there's coordination, because at this point we do have a few conjunctions, but we haven't really talked about how to coordinate either nouns or verbs, so we'll have to look into that. Then when it comes to participles, like I discussed, I think 3 or 4 episodes ago, something like that, still trying to decide how exactly to handle different tenses of participles, if that's even a thing that we're going to do, or if we're just going to leave that to relative clauses. I don't know. Then we need to figure out how passives work, as in true passives without agents, in converb clauses, because we do have a true passive, but it's only compatible at this point with the lexical verb. So we can have true passives in matrix clauses, but not in subordinate clauses, which isn't necessarily a deal breaker, but I need to do some thinking about how exactly that works. And then I thought we should probably talk about conditionals at some point, because we do have several conditional strategies at this point. Like we have a specific verb combination that's used for the conditional, which can be refined by adding some of the modal affixes. but that would specifically be for the, I can never remember, is it the apodosis, I think is what it's called? It's like the would clause, like I would do such and such. Whereas the protasis, the if clause, we have not yet talked about that. We don't know how to introduce a conditional clause. There might be a separate converb for that, or there might just be, a word that means if. I don't know, various different options. And then finally, I thought we might talk about color terms and numbers. And in fact, I was thinking we would start out with color terms today because, like I mentioned earlier, it's November for me right now, but Lexember is right around the corner. And I've done Lexember in previous years, but if you don't know what that is, it's a Conlanging tradition where you coin a new word for every day in December. Now, I'm probably not going to have time this December to coin a new word every single day. So what I thought we might do for this episode is a Lexember speed run, where I basically see how many words I can coin in one episode. And I have no idea how long this is going to take. Maybe I'll manage to fit it in one big episode, or maybe I'll have to split it up into smaller episodes, we'll see. So I've prepared some potential meanings for words that we can coin for Lexember. I can't remember if I've talked about this before, but just every so often I'll just have an idea for a particular word or derivation or something. Very often I'll just be listening to someone talking and they'll just use a particular construction that'll just strike my fancy, and then I'll ponder it for a bit and it will spark some kind of idea. And then I write those down and compile them in a list. So I've included here some of the ideas I've had over the past year, as well as just some general nouns and verbs and adjectives that we just don't have words for yet that would be quite useful. And I think before we get started, I might as well just tackle this one because it's one that I already have a form for. So I had this idea of an old verb that used to mean to be happy, broadening in sense to mean to be as it should be, to be in an ideal or natural state. And then with a directional applicative on top of that, that would literally be to be happy towards something, or to be happy with regards to something, which would just mean to be content with or to approve of. And then it occurred to me that that meaning of to be as one should be feels very modal, feels ripe for a modal prefix. So if it shortens up and becomes a prefix that would convey the meaning along the lines of should or ought to or something, I don't actually even know what that would be called. It's kind of an optative, but not quite. It's not really a jussive either. I don't know. But I came up with this form for the independent verb, and then applied the directional applicative to it. And for some reason, I didn't write down what the protoform was. But it would have been something like tal, because palatal laterals can serve as coders in the proto-lang, which means that when that becomes a modal prefix, if the auxiliary it attaches to begins in a consonant, it will be tal, whereas if it begins in a vowel, it will be tai, which is just kind of fun. Now, I am mindful of the fact that we do already have an optative. We have this prefix sin, which comes from the converb form of to hope or to wish, and it feels just a little bit superfluous to have both an optative and whatever this would be, so I still don't know exactly how I'm going to handle that. But in any case, I'm going to count that as our first word. Now, I don't know if I should treat these as being part of the same entry, since this one is just the same thing with the derivational prefix applied, or if I can get away with calling them two different entries. For now, I'm just going to treat them both as the same entry, but if I'm struggling later on and desperately need some more words, I might cheat a little bit and just say that it's a separate entry. Right, now, the main thing that I think we're going to tackle today is colors. Let's clear some space. Right, so color terms are something that I personally have never really been too fussed about. And it seems to me like many other conlangers are much more invested in it than I am. I don't really know why, but it's just never something that I've found particularly interesting. The most interesting thing that I think I've ever done with color terms was to just completely arbitrarily decide that Adun has separate color terms for light blue and dark blue. And I honestly cannot remember why I decided to do that, other than hearing at some point that that's what Russian does, and thinking to myself, well, if Russian does it, then so can I. Also in Nakachti, there are separate color terms for dark green or blue-green or sort of neutral green, which comes from the word for leaf or plant. And then there's a separate term for yellow-green, which comes from the word for chrysolite. But other than that, I've never really delved into the full range of possibilities with color terms. So I thought for this language we might do something a little bit different. because I did a little bit of research in preparation for this, and I was really surprised to see that, according to Walls, more than half of all the languages they sampled don't have a distinction in color terms between blue and green. Now, I knew it was a pretty substantial percentage of languages that didn't distinguish color terms for blue and green, but I didn't think it was more than half. So I think that is something that we might do in this language. So first of all, I guess we should start with the theory proposed by, I think it's Berlin and Kay, I always get mixed up with the names, but they proposed this model of how color terms develop in languages, which is far from universally accepted. There's a lot of other nuances to it that the model kind of ignores, but it's still a decent tool for conlanging purposes. And so basically, the theory says that languages go through cycles of generating color terms, where basically in the early stage, the most basic distinction that just about every language will have are terms for black and white. And then if a language has any color terms beyond those, the most likely is red, and then the next one is green and possibly yellow, and then blue, and then the rest, brown, pink, purple, etc. So I think we're going to say that this language does not have a separate word for blue. That will be included in the term for green. Now, yellow is a whole other deal that we're going to have to think about independently of that. So we'll have a single GRU color term. Now, we already have a word for black and white. Those are Sörde and Ticho, respectively. So we can get rid of those. So red and GRU are definitely going to be basic color terms. Now, if you want to specifically specify blue versus green, then you would modify the term GRU with some noun that exemplified that color. So for green, it would either be like grass or leaf or something like that. And then for blue, I was thinking it could either be sky or ocean or maybe just water. Now we do actually have a word for grass already, which is nimir. We don't have a word for leaf, but we do have words for sky, ocean, and water. Sky is talma, ocean is qem, and water, I can never remember what water is. Water is rin. And then there's yellow. Now we could say that yellow has its own separate color term, or we could say that yellow is considered a variety of red, and do a similar thing as we did here, where we pick some sort of prototypically yellow noun to classify or categorize the red. So something like sunflower red or something. I don't know, because I do kind of like the symmetry of having yellow be part of red and green be part of blue. It's kind of fun to have sort of minimal color terms in that way. But at the same time, I have to worry about orange. Because if red and yellow are separate color terms, then we could do what Old English did, and orange could be yellow-red. Or again, we could just pick some prototypically orange thing, like in fact the English word orange. Or it could be based on some modification of yellow in some way. Like I know in Navajo, the word for orange is based on the word for yellow, but with like an augmentative. So it's like a strong yellow. And then we get into the realm of things that I really don't know how to handle, like brown, purple, grey. We'll come back to those. For now, let's try and get some forms for the ones that we know that we're going to have as basic color terms, the red and the GRU. And something that immediately occurs to me is if the words for green and blue are compounds, like these words like mimir and talma get shoved onto the front of the root that means GRU, if the word that means GRU is disyllabic, which it almost certainly will be once it has case marking at the end, how does that affect stress? Because let's just say, just for the sake of example, that the word is kata. So if these were to compound together, where does the stress go? Because by the canonical system, stress falls on the antepenult, unless the penult is long or closed. But this is a phrase that means like sky grew, and it would just feel really weird to stress the ma in that, because it's like, what kind of kata is it? It's talmakata. It would just be really weird to say like talmakata. Unless it's just a very, very old compound, I don't see why the stress would change like that. And it feels most natural to me that the stress would be on the first syllable, which is kind of weird because it's the only instance in this language that stress would fall on the initial syllable of a word that is more than 3 syllables long. I mean, stress in this language is kind of all over the place, so I guess it's not a deal breaker. But if we go with these options for ocean or water, since those are monosyllabic, that sidesteps the whole issue. I kind of prefer the idea of using sky, though, because, at least in my mind, the sky is more obviously blue than the ocean. Like, especially since this culture is living in the quite far north, grey, frigid tundra sort of area, and having spent a fair bit of time by the North Sea, I would not overly describe it as being a blue sea. Or maybe we could use both terms. You know, ocean grue could specifically mean like a darker blue, whereas sky grue would mean like a turquoise or a cyan or something. And I don't really want to use water because obviously water is not actually blue. It's only under specific conditions like the ocean that it appears to be blue. So what's a form that would work well with both of those? We have a word final M for ocean, and I think we could use some more ML clusters. So I'm thinking something L initial, something like lika. Kind of like there to be a low vowel that's not because if the low vowels don't match in quality, that will mean that vowel harmony is not happening, which will make it extra obvious that this is a compound, and just drive home the fact that this is not a basic color term. Now, colors are adjectives most of the time, so we would need to work out what the ending would be in all three genders. I'm not going to bother going through the full declension chart for all of these, because, again, this is supposed to be a speed run, and plus we already have it on the list to work out the full declension system later. So just for the sake of time, we're only going to think about the nominative singular. In fact, if we say that K was adjective in the Pronoun, following vowel was a U, then it would lower to an O, and that means we get an and an O in the same word, which looks really weird. It's just such an obvious violation of vowel harmony, I kind of like that. Okay, so in the human gender, if you wanted to describe a person as being grue, for whatever reason, the singular ending is just a W, which would just assimilate straight into the U and be lost, so it would remain as just liko, whereas in the animate, O ending, the voiced uvula would be lost, the vowels would collapse together, lowering to an O, and then with word final vowel loss, that would also just become liko. But then in the inanimate, with a word final I, that would front the U to an E, which would then get lowered to an I. I mean, that does fit the pattern that I like, where the human and the animate classes look identical. Just out of curiosity, I want to see what it's like if we end it with an A. In the human class, the word final ao would become another O once diphthongs simplify. Same in the animate once the uvula disappears, whereas in the inanimate, the A and the I would merge into an E, so it would be lika. Yeah, I think I actually like that more. So going with that, our word for sky blue would be talmaliko, our word for ocean blue or dark blue would be qemliko, whereas for green, could do nimirliko, or we could come up with a word for leaf or plant or something, because I'm really torn about how to handle the stress with this, because it really feels like the stress should go on that antipenult, but that just kind of feels weird. I mean, we are looking to coin new words anyway. This is Lexember after all, so there's no harm in coming up with a word for leaf while we're here. What's a good word for leaf? A good, preferably monosyllabic word for leaf. It would have to end in a consonant that was allowed to come before the initial L. Can't be a stop. We already used a nasal. Guess it could just be a vowel. Kind of like the RL though. Sirliko is quite nice. Do I like the I vowel? Well, our word for black already begins with an S, and it has the vowel. We say that the protoform is something like silisi, or something like that, because the palatal lateral will just disappear, and the z will turn into an R eventually through roticism. So leaf, as a noun, will pretty much invariably be inanimate, so it will be appended with a final E suffix, which will just merge with the I of the stem, and then ultimately be lost. So sirliko. Yeah, I quite like that. And I like that better than nimirliko. So depending on how much credit I want to give myself, we've already done either 3 or 7 words. Now we come to red. We know that we're definitely going to have a basic term for red, so might as well coin that first. I'm mindful of the fact that more than likely at least one of these terms will be based on the term for red, so if we're going to have things compounding onto it, it needs to have an initial consonant, or just an initial sound in general, that would fit with that. So I'm thinking of maybe going vowel initial. I'm thinking I might like to add some more MB clusters, if possible. I know we've already got amba, which is the basis for our comparative construction. course, the suffix mbi always makes me think of Manchu, because that's the standard present tense ending. Maybe umbi? Umbi is okay. So if we say the protoform began with a pharyngeal, and the nasal coda could have been there from the beginning, or it could happen when vowel loss happens later. Now, umlaut happens after vowel loss between obstruents and sonorants, so whether or not the nasal was already in coda position from the protolang, that initial vowel is going to get umlauted. So running with that, in the human class, the W suffix would merge with the E to make E, so it would come out as imbu, whereas in the animate class, the uvula would drag the vowel down and therefore prevent umlaut from happening, so it would be ombo, and then in the inanimate it would just be umbi. Okay, so running with that for the time being, we're calling this basic term red, but it will likely be a much broader classification than the English word red. In fact, while I immediately think of it, one of the things on the list of potential nouns we have to make is blood. I think that would just work very well as a specifier for red, so we might as well coin this word now. What's a good word for blood, and a word that would go well with umbi? So if the word for red is vowel initial, and the word for blood is vowel final, that would cause some weird hiatus problems, which I'd prefer to avoid, so the word for blood should probably end in a consonant. Just about the only consonants that I like in that position are T and Q. If it was something like irtak, then blood red would be irtakumbu. That's pretty good. Do I want an initial consonant there? I don't think I do. Yeah, I'm feeling vowel initial for this one as well. Okay, so the protoform would have to be something like... see, that's a problem. Because if all the vowels are short, then that means that the stress will be on the antepenult. So either we say that that coda R was always there from the protolang, or we say that the vowel in the penult is long, and that would have dragged the stress towards it. Kind of feeling a short vowel. Now, is blood inanimate? I guess it would be, unless there's some sort of association with blood and life. But if it's animate, then with the animate ending, that will invariably make that final vowel long, which would mean it would stick around into the modern form and end in a vowel, which I don't like as much. Yeah, we'll go with irtak for now. So irtakumbi will mean something like deep red or dark red, something along those lines. And that actually gives me an idea for brown. Because thinking about things in the environment that are brown, two things that immediately come to mind are trees, as in like tree bark or wood, earth or soil or dirt. And we already have words for both of those. Because the word for tree is osto, which would be kind of weird if it's compounded onto this word, because that would be ostoimbu. So either we just put up with that hiatus, or we just say that one of the vowels gets elided away. Whereas the word for soil, or earth, if I'm not mistaken, is vad. Vadumbu is pretty good. Yeah, I think I'm just going to go with that. So earth red is brown. Before we move on to yellow, because I still don't really know how to handle that, it occurs to me that purple will probably be considered a type of liquor. So we need a noun that is prototypically purple. Now I know that the word purple comes from the Latin purpura, which ultimately comes from, I think it's an old word for a specific type of shellfish that they got purple dye from, I think. And in Navajo, I think the word for purple is based on a specific type of flower, which makes me immediately think of things like indigo, because indigo is the name of the plant, and the color came from that. So I'm trying to think of something that would be purple that this culture would realistically have access to. I mean, a flower does seem like a kind of obvious choice. That's one of the most colorful things in the environment. Or I guess fruit, actually. Something like berries, like a blackberry, which obviously in English we call them blackberries, but the juice of a blackberry is like a deep sort of purple color. Or I guess even red grapes. Like, we call them red grapes, and you get red wine from them, but they're not really red. Now, I don't think grapes would very easily grow in the sort of subarctic climate that these people live in. But there will definitely be types of berries that would grow, things like blackberries. So I'm just going to provisionally say blackberry, but any botanists watching, feel free to pose ideas for particular types of purple berries that grow in subarctic climates. I feel like this one should probably be vowel final, because we've just done a lot of consonant final words. I'm thinking something like mahe, so purple would be mahelike, so the protoform would just be like mahi, Wait, no it wouldn't, because that would lower the I and then vowel harmony would turn the into an A. It would have to be mahu. But if that was the case, then the inanimate suffix, because blackberry is definitely going to be inanimate, the U would turn into an E, which would cause umlaut, and then stressed becomes E, so it would become mihu. I don't think I like that as much, but if we change it back to A, it really does have to either be maha or mihu. Yeah, let's go with mihu. Mihulika. Okay, I've been putting it off long enough, now we get to yellow. I actually want to quickly check walls again to see if they have more info about this. Yeah, see, according to their sample, 68 out of 120 languages have a separate term for gru. But when it comes to red and yellow, 98 out of 120 languages have separate terms for red and yellow. Whereas having a term that means red or yellow does happen, but it's nowhere near as common. So if we were to just stick with the more likely option, then we would have a basic color term for yellow, but at the same time, having red and yellow be covered by just one color term is quite interesting. But if we did that, then I really don't know what I would do for orange, because the only other thing I can think to do is to coin another basic color term for orange, or to just use a noun for something that is orange, and I don't love either of those. See, if yellow wasn't a basic color term, I guess we could maybe use gold, so yellow would be gold red, but then again I would have no idea what to do for orange. Yeah, the more I think about it, the more I'm leaning towards make it a separate color term. So if yellow is a separate color term, then orange would be yellow-red. So the word for yellow, again, needs to go well with this umbu word. Like I said earlier, the only consonants that I like in that position are Q and T. We've already used Q for blood, so I guess our word for yellow is going to end in a T. I think I'm feeling an initial H. Doesn't need to be anything fancy. Maybe just something like hisat? Or actually no, that S would have to be geminate, because otherwise it would turn into hirat. But then we've got the same problem again, where stress would be on the antepenult, which means that we wouldn't be able to get that geminate unless the penult is long. So it'd have to be hisat. Yeah, I guess that's okay. It still feels kind of weird to have a long vowel in that position once it's compounded, because I really want to pronounce that as hisatombu, but at the same time that just doesn't feel natural. I don't know, I think that's good enough. So in the human gender, the W suffix would preserve that final vowel, so it would be hisata. Same with the animate, and it's only in the inanimate that it would be consonant final, which is fine because that's the one that's going to be compounded, unless we say that both elements of the compound have to agree in gender. And I know we've had this discussion before, but I can't remember specifically what the conclusion was, so I'm going to have to go back and revisit that. But for now, let's just leave it like that. And then I think the only color term left is grey. Now for grey, I don't really have too many ideas. I don't know if it would make sense for it to have its own color term, or if we should just, again, use a noun that is of that color. Trying to think of things in the environment that are grey. Metal is grey. Grey hair is grey. Clouds can be grey, like rain clouds or thunder clouds can be grey. Could the word for grey be the same as the word for cloud? To describe something as cloudy. Smoke is also grey. Or ash. Yeah, ashy, actually. I think that kind of works. We could just have a word that means ash and just use that. Or we could do what Turkish does, where the word for brown is kahverengi, where kahve is coffee, and the rengi is colour, so it's just coffee coloured. Yeah, I actually think that's pretty good. Let's go with ash. Could be an old word for ash that has since lost the meaning of ash and been replaced by something else. But at the same time, I kind of want to highlight the fact that it's not a basic colour term by having its etymology be very transparent. See, the only other thing I can think of is if we have a separate word that means pale that can also be used to mean grey, which actually reminds me, we might need some words for light and dark to go along with these. Now, I don't know how common it is for the terms light and dark to be used to describe shades of colour. I would guess it's pretty common, but I might need to do some research about that. In which case, if our word for pale is the same as the word for grey, I don't know, if you just call something pale on its own, without reference to another colour, does that imply that it's grey? Because if it doesn't, that kind of feels a bit too ambiguous for my liking. But if it does, then that feels a little bit too much like grey as its own colour term, which I think I want to avoid. You know, why not? Let's go with ash. So what's a good word for ash? Maybe an RV sequence, because I don't think we have one of those yet. And since I had the realization that V is actually phonemic, we can do that. In order to do that, the protoform would need a sibilant, and then a W, with a short unstressed vowel in between them, so that the W fortifies to a V when it's in contact with the S, and then the S voices and then ultimately roticizes. And of course, in order for that to happen, there would have to be another syllable before the S. Now that vowel in the final syllable has to be an A, because if it was an I, then the W would assimilate into it and it would become E, and if it was a U, then the W would assimilate into that and it would just be U. But yet again, we have the issue that that vowel has to be long in order to keep the antepenult unstressed. And also, W fortifying to V doesn't happen until long after vowel harmony. So if the vowels harmonize and that final R turns into a rounded vowel, then the W would just assimilate straight into it, and we would lose that sequence. The initial syllable cannot contain an U vowel. It has to be an R or an E. If we say the initial consonant is something that can drag that high vowel down, then we get erva, whereas if it doesn't, we get irva, which is just a little bit too similar to irtak for my taste. Do I want an initial consonant on there? The only consonant that I'm really feeling that might go well with that is a Y, but in order to justify that, there would have to be another syllable, which is fine, I think. So yerva is the word for ash. And then again, do we want the word for grey to just be the same as the word for ash? I don't think so. I think I do want some kind of suffix on there. We could use the basic adjective suffix to make ashy, but I'm actually feeling ash-coloured specifically. And we do need a word for colour anyway. What is a good word for colour? I'm thinking something quite simple, partially because it needs to compound with yerva and not be overly long, but also we have used a lot of consonant clusters in these words, so I'm thinking something CV, something like nimi, which in the proto-lang would just be numi, so grey would be yervanimi, ash-coloured. Yeah, that's pretty good. Okay, last thing to consider when it comes to colour terms is this whole light, dark, pale, bright thing. Ways of modifying colour terms to include shade and hue and things of that nature. So let me just quickly do some research. Okay, looking through Wikipedia, I have not found any immediate answers as to how languages usually describe brightness. For the sake of time, I think I'm just going to come up with terms for these now, and assume they can be generalized to mean just dark and light in general, but if they can't, then I'll just change the definitions later. Do we already have a word for dark? No, we do not. Okay, words for dark and light. I kind of like this word nolko. Feels more light to me. Nolko. That first syllable would need to be long, because the only way to get an O in that position is if we have a consonant in there that can lower the vowel and then disappear. And then there seems to be a theme this episode, but in order to get that cluster in that position, there either has to be a long vowel on the final syllable to draw the stress towards it, or that cluster has just existed since the proto-lang. And in this case, I'm going to go for the latter. So that's our word for light, or maybe pale, in terms of colour. Makes me think that maybe there should be a word for rich or deep as well, but maybe we could just use strong for that. I don't know, I think that's going to require some more thought. But then dark. I feel like we could use some more intervocalic Bs, which would therefore become Vs. Maybe something like klevi, which means that if you wanted to say dark blue, that would be klevi klimliko. I can't decide if I like that assonance or not. We'll go with it for now. The root would just be klubu. In order to prevent that final vowel from being lost, it would need to be long, which is fine. But in the human class, the W would just meld with the U's, and it would just be klova. In the animate, the suffix would lower the final vowel, and vowel harmony would kick in, so it would just be klovo. And only in the inanimate would it be klevi. Yep, that's cool. 3 different forms for the 3 genders. Whereas with nolko, it would remain nolko in all 3 genders, because in every case the final vowel will be a low vowel, which will just get flattened by vowel harmony. Okay, excellent. So I'm just going to go ahead and add those to the done list, and as I'm adding these to the list, I realize that we can get away with making another word here. We take the word for colour, and stick on our basic adjectival suffix, which I can never remember is he or ha, but it's ha. And that will be our word that means colourful. Right, I think that is pretty solid as far as color terms go. And depending on how you count, we've either coined 12 Lexember entries or 21. Not bad, not bad. And in fact, I think I'm going to call this episode here, just for the sake of neatness, having all the discussion of color terms contained within one episode. But I will record the next episode very shortly, and I reckon we'll probably tackle possessive classifiers next, because that's the other thing that I've done a little bit of research about beforehand in preparation for this. So, here ends part 1 of Who Knows, of the Lexember special, and I think just for the sake of time I'm actually going to forego the customary example sentence. I hope you'll forgive me, but I kind of want to keep things moving, so look out for the next episode, probably quite soon, and I will see you then for part 2.